In a country where the wrong outfit, a phone, and a clean car can make you a suspect, one young man's ordinary day turns into a nightmare, not because he broke the law, but because he looked like someone who might. But what happens when the police realize he's the last person they should have touched? This is not fiction. This is reality, and it's time we talked about it. Please sit back and witness a story that could happen to any of us. A story about identity, injustice, and the fight to be seen for who you truly are. The sun was just rising over Lagos. The streets were already full of life, buses honking, street vendors calling out, and tired workers heading off to start another long day. David James stepped out of a cozy restaurant where he had just finished a light breakfast. The restaurant wasn't fancy, but it was clean, quiet, and served good food. He had treated himself that morning. He had a full day ahead and wanted to start it well. He was only 24, but there was a calmness about him. He carried himself with quiet confidence and respect. He wore a clean black t-shirt, fitted jeans, and white sneakers. Nothing expensive, just simple and neat. His phone buzzed. It was a message from his mother. "Don't forget dinner tonight, 7 p.m. sharp, love you." David smiled and replied quickly, "I won't forget, Mum. Love you too." He wiped his hands and stepped out toward his parked car. It wasn't flashy, but it was comfortable. A cozy black Benz, the kind many would assume belonged to a working-class banker or someone with years of experience. David had saved for 2 years to buy it. He worked in tech, teaching kids how to code, building small websites for businesses, and recently consulting for a government-backed youth digital program. Nothing illegal, just hard work and long nights. As he reached for his car keys, he suddenly heard a voice behind him. "Excuse me, young man. Come here." David turned slowly. 2 men stood beside a black pickup truck. They wore plain clothes but carried guns. One had on dark sunglasses. The other had already started walking toward him. "Is this your car?" the first officer asked in a firm tone. "Yes, sir," David replied calmly. "Your own? At your age?" the second officer asked, his voice full of doubt. "What do you do for a living?" "I work in tech," David answered. "I'm on my way to the office." The 2 officers looked at each other. One of them walked around the car, inspecting it as if looking for something wrong. "You expect me to believe that?" the taller one said sharply. "You're dressed well, using a nice phone, and driving this kind of car. That's very suspicious." David felt a knot form in his stomach. He had heard stories. Friends of his had been stopped, insulted, even arrested, just for dressing well or driving a decent car while being young. He never thought it would happen to him. Not like this. Not today. He opened his mouth to explain again, but the taller officer raised his voice. "Get in the vehicle, now. We need to ask you some questions." David's chest tightened. And just like that, everything changed. He stood still for a second, confused and trying to stay calm. Everything about the situation felt wrong. He hadn't broken any laws, he hadn't disrespected anyone. But the officers had already made up their minds. One of them stepped forward, gripping David's arm tightly. "I said get in the vehicle. Don't make this harder for yourself." David raised his hands slightly, not to resist, but to show he had nothing to hide. "I don't understand, sir. Am I being arrested? What did I do wrong?" The officer didn't answer. Instead, he opened the door of the pickup and pushed David toward it. "Keep quiet and get inside," the other officer snapped. A few people on the street had started to watch. A man selling phone accessories across the road picked up his phone and began recording the scene quietly. His expression showed concern. David got into the back of the truck. He didn't want to resist or create a scene, but inside he felt helpless and angry. He kept wondering, why me? Why does my age, my clothes, and my car make me guilty in their eyes? The truck drove through the busy streets, past traffic, past shops, past people laughing, rushing, living their normal lives, while he sat in silence, treated like a criminal. They arrived at Zone 2 police station in less than 15 minutes. One officer opened the door and ordered him out. David stepped down quietly. The compound was noisy and chaotic. Officers moved about, files in hand, suspects seated in corners, some crying, some shouting. David had never been in a place like this before. "Sit over there," one of the officers said, pointing to a bench near the wall. He sat down without arguing. For the next hour, No one said a word to him. They didn't ask questions. They didn't check his ID. They didn't call anyone. They just left him sitting there like he was invisible. David looked around. He could see other young men like him, some in slippers, some in shirts, all quiet. No one looked dangerous, just scared, just tired. He thought about his laptop in the boot of his Benz. He thought about the children he was supposed to teach that day. He thought about his mother waiting for him to come home for dinner. Then he looked down at his hands and whispered to himself, "This can't be happening." But it was, and it was only the beginning. David sat on the wooden bench for what felt like forever. The noise in the station faded in and out, phones ringing, officers shouting, gates creaking, people crying, but no one came to speak to him. Finally, one of the officers who arrested him, the taller one, walked back in. He stood in front of David, arms folded, eyes cold. "So, David James," he said, reading from a paper. "You say you're a tech worker." "Yes, sir," David answered quietly. "I run digital training programs. I teach coding in schools. I also work with a government project on youth development." The officer laughed and shook his head. "Young boys like you always have big stories. Tech, government. Next thing you'll say you're related to the president. I'm not lying, sir." "Oh, really?" the officer said, stepping closer. "Then explain how you afford a clean Benz like that at your age, or that expensive phone in your pocket, or the wristwatch on your hand. You think we don't know Yahoo boys when we see them?" He leaned in slightly. "You've probably scammed plenty of mugu online, right? You sit behind a laptop pretending to be someone else. We know your type." David's chest tightened. "I worked hard for everything I have, sir. I saved for years to buy that car, and the phone is second-hand." "You expect us to believe that?" the officer snapped. "You boys are smart now. You know how to clear chats, wipe your phones, but we've been watching. We know your tricks." David looked up at him. His voice remained calm, but firm. "So being young and clean means I'm a criminal?" The officer didn't reply. Instead, he turned to another officer nearby and muttered, "Take him to the back. Let's search his phone." David stood up slowly. "Sir, with all due respect, I know my rights. You can't go through my private device without a warrant." The officer didn't like that. "Oh, so you're one of those human rights boys now," he said, raising his voice. "You think this is America? If you speak English from now till tomorrow, you'll still enter that cell." He turned to the sergeant beside him. "Search him, properly." Before David could say another word, his phone and wallet were taken. They checked his messages, his emails, his photos, everything. But there was nothing illegal. No fraud, no scam, no suspicious chats. Still, it didn't matter. "He's too smart," the sergeant said, shaking his head. "He must be hiding it somewhere else." David was taken to a small holding cell at the back of the station. The room was dark and smelled of damp cement. A single bench stretched across the wall. There was no fan, no air. As the door closed behind him, he sat down, buried his face in his hands, and took a deep breath. He wasn't afraid of prison. He was afraid of how easy it was for anyone to be seen as guilty in this country just because of how they looked. He sat alone in the dim holding cell. Time moved slowly. The small window high above the wall let in just a slice of sunlight, but it was already starting to fade. His white sneakers were now dusty. His phone and wallet were gone. No one had told him what would happen next. Outside the cell, he could hear laughter, loud conversations, footsteps moving back and forth, but no one paid him any attention. He looked at the walls, dirty, cracked, and covered in old scribbles. Names, dates, words like innocent and God save me. People had been here before him, and sadly, many more would still come. He sat in silence, trying not to panic. What will Mum think when I don't show up for dinner? What if they refuse to let me go? What if they try to frame me with something fake? Suddenly, the door opened with a loud creak. An older officer peeked in. "You, come out." David stood up slowly. The officer didn't look angry like the others. He seemed tired. They walked back toward the front desk. As they passed the open hall, David saw people watching him. Some suspects, some officers, and a few civilians waiting for answers. At the corner of the room stood a younger officer, maybe in his late 20s, wearing glasses and scrolling through his phone. His name tag read, Corporal John. As David walked past, John looked up. Their eyes met for a second. David gave a slight nod. Just a quiet signal that said, He was led to a desk where Sergeant Mike, the second officer from the arrest, sat, drinking a cold malt drink. He didn't even look up as David sat down. "Nothing on his phone," Mike said lazily. "He's either very smart or very lucky." David stayed quiet. Just then, the officer with glasses, Corporal John, walked over. "Excuse me, sir," he said, addressing Mike. "What's the young man's name again?" "David James," Mike answered, waving him off. "Why?" John didn't reply. Instead, he stepped back, unlocked his phone, and typed something in. A moment later, his eyes widened slightly. He quickly tapped through a few links, then looked up at David again. He stared for a second longer, like something just clicked. Then he walked away quietly. David didn't know what he had seen, but for the first time since the arrest, he felt a small shift, a flicker of hope. Corporal John sat at his corner desk, the soft glow from his phone screen lighting up his focused expression. He had just searched the name, David James. The results made him sit up straighter. David James, Youth Tech Consultant, empowering Nigerian students through code. David James leads government-supported digital bootcamp for young developers. Son of retired Supreme Court Justice Mark James speaks on youth and innovation. John blinked. This wasn't some random young man showing off in a Benz. This was someone with influence, someone with a solid name and a purpose, someone wrongly profiled. He quickly stood and walked down the hallway toward the DPO's office. She was new, but already gaining a reputation for being strict and fair. Officers whispered that she had transferred from Abuja to clean up Lagos nonsense. Her name was DPO Clara. He knocked once, then stepped in. She was at her desk, going through case files. Her face was calm, but her eyes were sharp. "Yes, Corporal John." "Ma," he said, stepping closer and holding out his phone. "I believe there's been a serious mistake." She took the phone and scrolled through the search results. With each headline, her expression changed. "Where is this young man now?" she asked. "In the holding cell, Ma. He was brought in this morning. SARS officers picked him up, said he looked suspicious, dressed well, driving a Benz, said he fit the profile." Clara looked at John, then back at the phone. "Get me his file. Bring Officers Fred and Mike to my office immediately." Back in the holding cell, David sat with his back against the cold wall. His head leaned back, eyes closed. His mind was racing, but he didn't want to panic. Footsteps echoed outside the hallway. Then the door creaked open again. "You, follow me." David stood up without a word. The officer didn't speak either. He just led him down the corridor. But something felt different this time. There was less tension, less hostility. When they reached the front of the station, he was told to wait outside the DPO's office. A few minutes later, he was called in. There stood DPO Clara, behind her desk, calm but firm. Corporal John stood to the side. Fred and Mike, the two officers who arrested him, stood at the back, hands folded, faces tense. Clara looked straight at David. "You're David James?" "Yes, Ma." "You work with the Ministry of Digital Economy?" "Yes, Ma." "You were arrested without evidence of a crime?" "Yes, Ma." She turned to Fred and Mike. "Did he resist arrest?" They didn't answer. "Did you find anything illegal on him?" Silence again. "Did he threaten you, insult you, or commit any offense?" "No, Ma," Mike said finally, voice low. Clara leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. "I hope the two of you understand just how serious this is." David stood quietly, but inside him something had shifted. Finally, someone was listening. The silence in DPO Clara's office was thick. Fred and Mike stood stiff, avoiding eye contact. David remained standing, calm but alert. Corporal John shifted slightly, watching everything. Clara took a deep breath. "You didn't ask for identification. You didn't confirm ownership of the vehicle. You didn't follow protocol. You judged this young man based on what? His age? His clothes? The fact that he drove a Benz?" Fred opened his mouth to speak, but Clara raised her hand. "Save it. We'll get to your report." She turned back to David. "I'm very sorry about this, Mr. James." David nodded slowly. "Thank you, Ma." Clara picked up the printed search results from John and glanced through them again. Consultant for a federal digital program, speaker at multiple tech summits, co-founder of a youth coding academy, and son of retired Supreme Court Justice Mark James. Fred and Mike's eyes widened slightly. David noticed. Clara noticed too. "Now you understand the damage you've done," she said. looking sharply at both men. "You didn't just harass a citizen, you arrested a national figure without cause. If this gets out, it won't just be your names on the line, it'll be this entire division." Mike's voice cracked slightly. "He didn't say who he was, Ma. He didn't tell us. He shouldn't have to," Clara snapped. "You should have done your job." She paused, then picked up her phone and made a call. "Commissioner's office, please. Tell him it's urgent." David stood silently as she spoke with the commissioner, briefly explaining the situation. When she ended the call, she looked at Corporal John. "Take Mr. James outside. Get him water. Make sure he's comfortable. I'll call him back in shortly." "Yes, Ma," John replied. As they walked out, David turned slightly to glance back at the two officers. Their pride was gone. All that was left was fear and guilt. Outside the office, John handed David a cold bottle of water and motioned to a bench under the shaded corridor. "I'm sorry this happened," he said quietly. "It shouldn't have." David gave a tired smile. "It's okay. You helped. That means something." A few minutes later, David's phone returned to him, buzzed again. Dozens of missed calls, messages, notifications. One message stood out. It was from his father. "I just saw the video. I'm on my way. Stay calm." David blinked. "Video? What video?" He opened his Twitter app and saw it clear as day. A street recording of his arrest outside the restaurant, the officers shouting at him, forcing him into the pickup, his hands raised, his voice calm. The caption read, "This is what it means to be young and successful in Nigeria." And the video had already gone viral. Thousands of retweets, angry comments, news blogs tagging his name. David's chest tightened, not from fear, but from the weight of it all. It was no longer just about him. Inside the office, DPO Clara sat alone, staring at the printed news headlines on her desk. Then she looked toward the door. She knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The door to DPO Clara's office swung open as she stepped out into the corridor. The sun had shifted slightly. Her heels echoed sharply against the tiled floor as she walked straight into the main hall, where officers were moving about, pretending to be busy. "Officers Fred and Mike," she called out firmly. "Follow me to the conference room. Corporal John, come too." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The station quieted slightly. Fred and Mike exchanged a glance but didn't argue. They followed behind like students summoned by the principal. John walked beside them, calm but alert. Inside the conference room, Clara stood at the head of the table. The viral video of David's arrest played silently on a mounted screen behind her. She had connected it from her tablet. There was no need for sound, the images spoke louder. David's calm face, the officers shouting, the hand grabbing his arm, the bystanders staring, the forceful push into the vehicle. Clara turned toward them. "Take a good look," she said coldly. "This is not just a mistake, this is a public disgrace. This is how our uniform is being seen everywhere right now." Fred looked away. Mike stayed still, hands clenched. "Do you know who that boy is?" Clara asked, her voice sharp but steady. "Tech expert. A young man who's doing more for this country's youth than most people in this building." No response. "And you humiliated him, in public. For what? Because he looked too clean? Because he drove a Benz? Because he didn't beg?" Still silence. Clara shook her head slowly. "You didn't just arrest the wrong person. You exposed everything wrong with how we do our jobs." She picked up a file and slapped it down on the table. "I've already called the commissioner. An internal investigation is being opened. You will both write full statements. Today." Fred finally spoke, his voice shaky. "Ma, we were just—" "Don't finish that sentence," Clara cut him off. "You were assuming. And now we all have to face the consequences." She turned to John. "Start drafting a press briefing. I want our response ready before this gets worse." "Yes, Ma." As she dismissed them, Clara walked out into the station's open walkway. Her shoulders were square, her jaw tight. She knew eyes were watching her. She didn't care. At the far end of the compound, she saw a black SUV pulling up. The door opened, and stepping out in a dark native attire was a tall, elderly man with a strong presence. Justice Mark James. The moment their eyes met, Clara felt the full weight of what was coming. This wasn't just another case. It was about to become a national moment. By the time Justice Mark James stepped into the compound, the station was already buzzing. Officers whispered to one another as he passed. No one needed an introduction. His name still held weight. Former Supreme Court Justice, known for his firm stance on human rights and accountability. He walked slowly, but with purpose. His presence alone commanded respect. DPO Clara met him just outside her office. "Sir," she said, offering a respectful nod. "I'm deeply sorry for what happened to your son." Justice James didn't return the smile. His expression was unreadable. "I didn't come here for apologies, Madam Officer," he said in a calm but cold voice. "I came to see my son, and to understand how a boy who has done nothing wrong could be thrown into the back of a police truck like a criminal because he dared to look successful." Clara stepped aside. "He's in the waiting room. You can see him now." Justice James walked in and saw David seated on a plastic chair, sipping from a bottle of water. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the firm man became a father again. "Dad," David said, standing up. Justice James pulled him into a brief hug. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," David replied. "They didn't hurt me." His father stepped back and looked him over, nodding slightly. "Good, because this is not the end of it." Outside the station, things were already spiraling. The video of David's arrest had spread like wildfire across social media. News channels picked it up. Hashtags were trending. #end police brutality. #end profiling now. #not every young man is Yahoo. Influencers, celebrities, and everyday Nigerians had begun speaking out. We've all been David at some point. How long will we keep profiling young men for having ambition? Enough is enough. One online blog published a profile on David's achievements, calling him a symbol of the youth Nigeria keeps punishing. Another ran with the headline, "Justice James's son arrested by SARS for driving a Benz." In front of the station gate, a small crowd had gathered, journalists, activists, curious onlookers. A reporter from Galaxy TV raised a microphone and said into the camera, "We are here live at Zone 2 police station in Lagos, where the wrong arrest of a young man has sparked national attention." Behind these gates is David James, a well-known tech expert, and the son of retired Supreme Court Justice Mark James. The question Nigerians are asking is simple. How many more Davids are out there, without names, without fathers in power, suffering the same fate? Inside, Clara watched it all unfold from her office window. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Emails, press statements, questions from her superiors. The station was surrounded. She knew she had to act fast, not just for the sake of optics, but for justice. She turned to her assistant. "Call a meeting. I want every department head in the briefing room. Now." The atmosphere in the station shifted from busy to tense. Officers who had laughed casually in the morning now walked briskly and avoided eye contact. The viral video had changed everything. What once seemed like just another arrest had become a national crisis. Inside the conference room, the senior officers sat around the long table, restless. DPO Clara stood at the front, arms crossed, watching the screen behind her as a news anchor read aloud the latest update. "Justice Mark James has arrived at the Lagos Police Command following the wrongful arrest of his son, David James. The Inspector General's office has requested a full report by the end of the day. Meanwhile, citizens continue to gather outside Zone 2 station, demanding reform and accountability." Clara clicked off the screen. "We have a problem," she said flatly. No one argued. She looked around the room, her gaze hard. The public is angry. The media is outside. The commissioner wants answers, and the Inspector General is watching. So we're going to give answers, and the truth. She held up a file. "This is the internal report Corporal John helped compile. It shows that David James has no criminal history, no known associations with any fraud-related activity, and was, at the time of arrest, on his way to fulfill official duties with a federal youth program. Everything about his arrest, from the profiling to the search, was unlawful." She turned to Fred and Mike, who were seated quietly at the far end of the room. "You will both submit written statements, effective immediately. You will be relieved of field duties pending disciplinary review." Fred opened his mouth. "Ma, don't," Clara said sharply. "This is not about embarrassment. This is about accountability. We're not covering this up." Then, as if on cue, a staff officer entered the room and whispered something in her ear. Clara turned back to the room. "Justice Mark James has requested a private meeting with me." In her office minutes later, Clara stood as the former judge walked in. "Sit, sir," she said respectfully. He remained standing. "Young lady," he began, voice controlled but heavy, "I've spent my entire career fighting to make this country better. I've sentenced corrupt men, exposed bad law, and protected innocent ones. But what happened to my son today? It reminded me how broken this country still is." Clara nodded slowly. "Sir, I understand, and I agree with you, but I want you to know we're handling this the right way." Justice James walked toward the window, looking out at the growing crowd beyond the gates. "My son is lucky. He has a name, a platform. But what about the ones who don't? Who gets justice for them?" Clara stayed silent. He turned back to her. "If you truly want to fix this, then don't just write a report. Make it mean something." She nodded. "I intend to." He studied her for a moment, then quietly said, "Good. Then I'll let you do your job." And with that, he walked out of her office, leaving behind a silence that echoed louder than his words. By mid-afternoon, the heat had grown heavy. Outside the police station, the crowd had doubled. News vans lined the street. Protesters held up signs that read, "Stop profiling our youth. Being young and successful is not a crime. We are all David James." Inside the station, David sat quietly in a small office beside Corporal John, sipping water and scrolling through the storm of messages on his phone. Mentions, tags, articles. Some messages were from people he hadn't spoken to in years. Others were from total strangers. "Thank you for standing strong. You're a voice for the rest of us. This could have been me." Then came the knock. Clara stepped in. "David," she said gently, "the press is asking for a statement. You don't have to speak, but if you want to, they're waiting." David looked up, calm but resolute. "I'll speak." Outside, a makeshift podium had been set up at the station's entrance. Journalists swarmed, cameras ready. Officers stood in position, tense but silent. The crowd hushed as David James stepped forward, flanked by Clara and his father, Justice Mark James. He stood before the microphones. "My name is David James. I'm 24 years old. I work in tech. I build tools to help young Nigerians learn digital skills. I've never committed a crime. I've never even been questioned until today." He paused. The air was still. "This morning I stepped out of a restaurant and headed to my car, a car I worked hard for. I was stopped, searched, called a criminal, and arrested." He took a breath. "Why? Because I look too young to drive a Benz? Because I dressed well? Because I carry a phone?" Murmurs in the crowd. Cameras zoomed in. "This is not just about me. It's about every young Nigerian who has been judged before they've been heard, who has been stopped because of how they look, who has been labeled because of what they wear or drive." David glanced at his father, then back at the crowd. "Respect should not depend on your last name, or your connections, or how loud the internet shouts for you. Justice should be for everyone, or it is not justice at all." He paused, voice steady. "I don't want revenge. I want reform. I want change." Then, softly, almost to himself, he added, "If you must search me, but also search your conscience." The crowd erupted into applause. Even some officers nodded subtly. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled. Voices called out his name. But David turned and walked away quietly, because for him, this wasn't about attention. It was about finally being seen. Later that evening, something powerful began to unfold. Inspired by David's words, thousands of young Nigerians took to social media to share their own stories. They posted under the hashtag #MyPoliceStory. Stories poured in. A university student arrested at night because he had dreadlocks and a laptop. A software developer forced to pay $200,000 to avoid being detained while returning from work. A graphic designer dragged out of a cab, searched, slapped, and called a fraudster for wearing sneakers and carrying an iPhone. A corps member held for hours under a bridge until her parents paid a bribe, simply for walking home with a male friend after dark. The stories were raw, emotional, real. Each one was a reflection of the silent fear so many young Nigerians had learned to carry. But now their voices were being heard, together, louder than ever before. The ripple had begun. By the next morning, the entire country was talking. Radio stations ran call-in shows filled with angry voices. TV panels debated policing standards. Newspapers ran front-page headlines. David James speaks, a nation responds. Youth profiling, a crisis in uniform. Hash my Paula story, when the system fails the innocent. Inside Zone 2 police station, the pressure was mounting. The police commissioner had arrived unannounced. A stern man with a graying beard and piercing eyes, he walked straight into the briefing room where DPO Clara, Corporal John, and other senior officers were gathered. "Where are Officers Fred and Mike?" he asked. "Outside, awaiting instructions, sir," Clara responded. "Good, bring them in." Moments later, Fred and Mike entered, looking like shadows of the men who had once barked orders at David. Their uniforms were neatly ironed, but their confidence had vanished. The commissioner didn't sit. "You know what's happening outside?" he asked them. "People are angry, rightfully angry. You didn't just disgrace yourselves. You brought disgrace on the uniform." Neither officer replied. He continued. "This isn't about protocol anymore. It's about public trust, and both of you shattered it." He turned to Clara. "Suspend them from active duty, effective immediately. Their conduct report is to be forwarded to Abuja for disciplinary review." "Yes, sir," she replied. Then he faced the room. "We're not just apologizing, we're rebuilding." Later that day, in a televised press briefing, the commissioner addressed the nation from outside the station gates. "I want to begin by saying we failed," he said. "The arrest of David James was unjust, and it has revealed deeper issues we cannot ignore." He paused, then continued. "The Nigeria police force is initiating a nationwide review of youth profiling cases. Officers will undergo new mandatory training focused on human rights, de-escalation, and community engagement. We are setting up independent complaint desks and community monitoring teams." A few feet away, David stood beside his father, watching. Then the commissioner did something no one expected. He stepped aside and offered David the podium. David looked at his father. Justice James gave him a quiet nod. He stepped forward. "This isn't just a victory for me," David said. "It's a chance for something greater. If we want real change, we can't stop here. We must keep pushing, for the silent ones, the scared ones, the ones who didn't have a camera recording." Inside the station, Officers Fred and Mike sat in silence, filling out their disciplinary reports. Neither of them spoke. Fred occasionally glanced at the TV mounted on the wall showing the live press conference. When he heard David say, "I don't want revenge, I want reform," he looked down in shame. For the first time in a long while, he wondered what it might feel like to be better at his job. Weeks passed, but the momentum didn't slow down. David's story had lit a spark, but what came after began to feel like a slow-burning fire of change, steady, persistent, and real. Under public pressure and support from the Ministry of Youth Development, the Nigeria Police Force officially launched the Youth Police Reform Task Force, with David James appointed as its youngest member. The initiative had 3 goals: end unlawful profiling of young Nigerians, train officers in digital literacy and modern policing ethics, create local community partnerships between the police and the public. At Zone 2 police station, transformation had begun. The once overcrowded front desk now had a human rights help desk, manned by trained officers and rotating lawyers from civil society groups. Officers like Corporal John, who had played a quiet but critical role in exposing the truth, were selected to lead internal seminars on responsible policing. He spoke to new recruits about David's arrest, not just as a mistake, but as a warning. "The boy they dragged into a cell could have been your brother," he said during a training session. "You need to stop seeing every young man with a phone as a criminal." Recruits listened, some nodded, some asked questions, and for the first time conversations were happening, real ones. David, meanwhile, traveled across states to speak at universities, town halls, and youth events. Everywhere he went, the story repeated itself. "They stopped me because I wore dreadlocks. I paid 50,000 to avoid being taken to a station. They searched my phone, found nothing, and still called me a thief." Each story became a page in the reform blueprint he was helping to write. At one event in Port Harcourt, a young girl raised her hand and asked, "Do you think they'll ever truly stop treating us like suspects just because we're young?" David smiled gently. "They won't unless we make them, and that's why we keep pushing. In Abuja, the Inspector General issued a new directive mandating body cameras for all SARS units, a digital complaint platform, and monthly youth police town halls. For the first time, David believed something was shifting. Not fast, not everywhere, but enough to matter. At home one evening, David sat on the balcony with his father. The sky was purple with the last light of sunset. The air was quiet. Justice James looked at his son with a rare softness. "I've fought for justice all my life," he said. "But I think you've done more with one speech than I did with 10 verdicts." David chuckled. "I think we're just getting started." His father nodded. "Good, because Nigeria still has a long way to go." It had been nearly a year since that morning when David James was wrongly arrested outside a restaurant. But the memory of it remained, not as a wound, but as a reminder, a turning point. At Zone 2 police station, the difference was now visible, not just in structure but in spirit. The front entrance, once crowded and chaotic, had been repainted and reorganized. A new sign stood by the gate. "This is a reform-driven station. Every citizen deserves dignity." Inside, a digital check-in kiosk replaced the old logbook. Civilians could file complaints, request legal aid, or speak to a liaison officer. No bribes, no shouting, no intimidation. In a small office to the left, Corporal John now led the community relations desk. On the wall behind him hung 2 photos, one of David James shaking hands with the Inspector General, and another of a town hall meeting packed with young people. John had become something of a quiet symbol, not a hero, but proof that one honest decision can change everything. He often told junior officers, "It costs nothing to listen, but it could cost everything if you don't." In a corner of the compound, DPO Clara stood beside a group of schoolchildren on an excursion tour. She smiled as she explained how the station was changing, how the police were learning to serve, not just command. She watched as one little boy raised his hand and asked, "Can police say sorry when they make a mistake?" Clara didn't flinch. "Yes," she said, "and not just say it, but show it." The officers who had arrested David, Fred, and Mike were not just suspended. An internal investigation uncovered multiple past complaints against them: unlawful arrests, extortion, intimidation, even falsified reports. Offenses that had been ignored until now. They were both dismissed from the force, stripped of their ranks. As public outcry grew, they faced possible criminal charges in a pending case under review by the Justice Ministry. Jail time was no longer just a threat. It was a very real possibility. As for David, he didn't stop. He continued working with government programs, helping build a platform where citizens could track misconduct reports and see how cases were handled. He co-authored a youth guide titled "Know Your Rights, Protect Your Life," now distributed to secondary schools nationwide, and he taught relentlessly. He gathered young people in schools, youth centers, and even tech hubs to talk about the internet, not just as a tool for money, but for purpose. "Yes," he would say, "there are young people using the internet for the wrong things. That's true, but that doesn't mean we should all wear the stain." He taught them how to use tech for growth, how to build, not scam. And more than that, he worked with cybersecurity experts to design devices and software to help the police track real online crime, so that law enforcement could rely on data, not appearances. "If we want change," he said one day during a seminar, "we have to break the chain from both sides. We have to stop abusing technology, and they must stop abusing power." One afternoon, as the Harmattan wind rolled through the city, David returned quietly to Zone 2 station. Not for drama, not for press, just to sit in silence. He took a seat on the same bench he had once waited on after being arrested. He looked around, and for the first time, he didn't feel afraid. He felt hope. The evening was calm, the air still and thoughtful, as if the city itself had paused to breathe. David sat on the porch of his family home, a quiet corner of Ikoyi, surrounded by trees and the gentle clinking of teacups. His mother sat beside him, wrapping her hands around a warm mug, her eyes soft and filled with quiet pride. Across from them, Justice Mark James leaned back in his chair, reading the day's newspaper. The headline read, "Youth Reformer David James, honored by National Assembly for civil contribution to police reform." He folded the paper neatly and looked at his son. You've done more than I ever imagined, David. David smiled, slightly embarrassed. I didn't do it alone. His mother placed her hand on his. But you led the way, she said gently. You brought home what you saw in America, not just the systems, but the mindset, accountability, dignity, change. David nodded slowly. During his university years in the United States, he had sat in rooms where change was debated, where justice was demanded and delivered. He had always dreamed of coming home, not to complain, but to contribute. And now, one change at a time, he was doing exactly that. Across the country, new things were happening. Police academies introduced digital ethics and profiling reform into their training. The citizen complaint app David helped build had logged over 30,000 reports in 2 months, many of them resolved. A startup fund was created for young Nigerians building solutions for social change, named the D. James Youth Impact Grant. David continued teaching, writing, mentoring, not for fame but for the ones watching from the shadows, still afraid to speak. One afternoon he received a message from a teenager in Kano. I want to become a tech reformer like you. Not to be famous, just to make people listen. David read it slowly, then smiled. That, right there, was the real reward. On the 1-year anniversary of his arrest, David gave a speech at the National Human Rights Summit in Abuja. To every young person who has been profiled, silenced, or shamed, know this: you are not the problem. You are the answer. And to every officer who chooses integrity over abuse, thank you. Together we are building a Nigeria where justice doesn't wear rank, it wears responsibility.